Hello everyone, how's it going? It's me, the book and movie guy here, as always, and by always I mean when I occasionally make videos from time to time, which is more than just occasionally, but you know, not all the time. And today I am bringing you a video about a book called The Gunslinger by little known author Stephen King. It really just doesn't have a lot of attention, and I wanted to give more exposure to this really neat little indie work. Okay, obviously it's not an indie book. Well, Stephen King is like, you know, Stephen King. So basically with this video and with, you know, several subsequent videos, I'm going to be focusing on one trait of each one of the Dark Tower novels that I think exemplifies what makes the series great and what that book does particularly well. So, for example, in this video, I'm going to be focusing on how The Gunslinger perfectly uses atmosphere to tell its story, and how The Gunslinger is probably Stephen King's best use of atmosphere throughout his entire written bibliography. Works, universe, writings, storytellings, creations, yeah. So I initially read the Dark Tower books way back in high school, which wasn't actually that long ago, but I first started reading them in 9th or 10th grade, and I'm now 23, so it's been like 8 years. And while I liked the books on my first reading, I was not blown away by them in quite the same way a lot of other Stephen King fans were. The Stand has still always been my favorite of Stephen King's works, and currently as of this moment, it still is. I don't know if my rereading of The Dark Tower will surpass The Stand, but I am definitely appreciating these Dark Tower books way more than I did way back when I was in high school. Anyways, going back through these books as an adult, there are a lot of things from a writing perspective that I'm noticing that I really just was blissfully unaware of back in the days when I was in high school. One of those things, of course, being the incredible atmosphere of The Gunslinger. When I first read The Gunslinger, I really liked it. I thought it was cool, I thought it was neat, but I didn't quite have the writing know-how to pin down what I really liked about it. And on a second reading, what I really liked about it was the atmosphere. So of course, for those of you who don't know, but I'm sure all of you do, atmosphere is kind of the feeling or general mood that a work invokes. At least that's how I explain it to my students. The atmosphere of The Gunslinger is really unparalleled, and the reason I think it stands out to me so much is because Stephen King uses it as a massive storytelling device here. He doesn't just use it to uplift his settings. The setting essentially is the story, and the setting tells us a lot that we need to know about Roland, the Gunslinger, Midworld, and everything that happened before the series of books began. Unlike a lot of Stephen King's other books, and even other books in this series, The Gunslinger has a really stripped down and minimalist approach to writing. Not only is it short, but also the writing in it is short. Short sentences, short descriptions, short passages, short everything. Normally, Stephen King takes a pretty basic approach in terms of sentence length and frequency of like verbs and adjectives and such, but The Gunslinger is one of his few works where I feel like he is very intentionally choosing his words and curating his sentence and paragraph length, and I'm sure that he would say he always does that because he talks about it a lot in On Writing, but I don't think it always comes through. A lot of Stephen King's works, particularly his newer works from the past 10 years or so, I feel are very overwritten. They're very standard, and they don't really have a whole lot of style or voice. And for as much as I enjoy Stephen King's works, I think that largely is the biggest issue with his body of work in general, is the lack of varied style throughout each of his works. He has a very distinct and unique and fun voice, but that doesn't always translate necessarily into an effective or unique style for each of his works, especially again in the past decade or so. The Gunslinger, however, feels very different than a lot of his other works. Again, the tone and the atmosphere are a huge part of that. They don't have this kind of casual fling of language that Stephen King's later books do. They don't have quite the same sense of humor. He's a lot more cynical here, a lot more simple, a lot more stripped down and kind of bare bones. It's really similar to the Bachman books, and the reason for that is that it was written around the same time as those books. And the difference between The Gunslinger and The Drawing of the Three is like crazy. The Drawing of the Three is not overwritten, I wouldn't say, but it's definitely more thickly, more densely, more overwritten than The Gunslinger in comparison. The other thing I will say about Stephen King is that he's a great storyteller and he's a fairly competent writer, but very rarely am I reading a Stephen King work and he hits me with a banger quote that like blows me away. I mean, if you read like a John Steinbeck, a Ray Bradbury, a Cormac McCarthy, Haruki Murakami, Toni Morrison, whatever, William Faulkner, all those authors constantly, like pretty much every sentence you could just pluck out and like put on your wall or get tattooed and then like get beat up at the bar because of the tattoo or something. Stephen King is not that kind of author. He's usually very functional and kind of utilitarian, but The Gunslinger is a huge exception to that. Some of Stephen King's best, most beautifully written, and most memorable quotes are from the Dark Tower series in general, but from The Gunslinger specifically. For instance, one of his most famous lines that you will see in the comment of every like weird fan-made Dark Tower movie trailer and everything else out there is, "The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed." This is a kick-ass quote. It's a kick-ass opening quote as well. The reason? Atmosphere. And also imagery. So this is a very simple image, right? We've got a man in black, easy to picture. Dude wearing black clothes, trench coat, hat, maybe, whatever. And he's fleeing across the desert, right? We can all picture a desert, wide expanse of desert. And then a gunslinger, what do we picture? A cowboy, probably looks like Clint Eastwood. And he's following him. Why? We don't know. He just is. Yet that creates a pretty powerful image and story all in one sentence. In a way, it's similar to like the Ernest Hemingway "For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn" thing. And I know that like this video will get reposted in like r/writing circle jerk on Reddit, and people will make fun of me for comparing the two things. But I think from a writing perspective, we can put aside our pretensions that the comparison is pretty apt. Like you get a lot of information and ambiguity from this opening line, and it's a perfect hook. Like, oh, who's the man in black? Who's the gunslinger? Why are they in the desert? Why are they following? What's going on here? And it really makes you want to read more. Yet it's extremely simple, it's not over descriptive, it just uses huge monolithic imagery that tap into a cultural consciousness that we can all apply to our own imaginations in order to send an effective message and image and pull us into the story at hand. The other line in this book that I think is extremely memorable is, of course, the "Go now, there are other worlds than these." In the context of the story, this is said between Roland and Jake when Roland is letting Jake fall to his death on his quest for the tower. There are all these things out there in the world to explore and to know, particularly from books, and I just think that it's a lovely quote that applies very well to the story, but also to just like being a reader or like being a lover of stories and film and whatever. It's the same way Stephen King uses language and descriptions throughout the book. You will know that there are other things out there, in this case sentences being worlds or descriptions being worlds or whatever, but you don't know what they are, so it creates an ambiguity that makes the book somewhat more terrifying. If you're a long-time viewer, which you're probably not, but if you are, I talked about this at length in my video on The Road by Cormac McCarthy, where again, that stripped-down use of language allows your mind to fill in the blanks and create a lot of images of terror that an author simply could not, because your imagination knows what you are afraid of more than an author does. Another quote that highlights this is early in the novel, and it's too long for me to memorize, so I'm just going to read it off my cracked cell phone here. And that quote is, "An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway, and coaches had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied." I like this quote for all the reasons I just said about the other worlds in these quotes, but I think this one is in a sense creepier because again, it gives Midworld such a really haunted and lonely feel that the other novels just don't quite have as much. And again, it taps into some very familiar monolithic Western imagery that I think is very effective for this book. I mean, it's not a traditional Western story, it's basically like a Western ghost story. And the idea of a world moving on is something that I think of whenever I'm in an abandoned or rural area, or even if I'm the only one in an area. Like, I'm in a parking lot leaving work or the store after everyone else has and I'm the only one around. It's easy to feel like the world has moved on from you. And that's an idea of atmosphere that I absolutely love because it works to improve the setting of the book, but it also taps perfectly into Roland's mood and psyche as a character. The world has moved on from him and he can't move on with it. And in that vein, this book also portrays loneliness very, very well. The only other books that I think come even remotely close to this one and how effectively they portray loneliness are The Road, Cormac McCarthy, which I talked about already, and this other book, which actually is overlooked, unlike The Gunslinger, but Death is a Lonely Business by Ray Bradbury. Obviously, Ray Bradbury is an extremely successful author, popular, famous, but nobody really talks about this book. And I think this might convey loneliness better than The Gunslinger, but you know, these two books and The Gunslinger both convey loneliness in an extremely effective way. But Stephen King used it differently in those two authors in that loneliness is more than just a tool for atmosphere and setting and character. It is also something that is used to connect to the theme or the major idea of the book and series, which is that addiction is lonely. There's been a lot of commentary and writings about the Dark Tower ultimately being a metaphor for addiction. Stephen King struggled with addiction a lot. Addiction was kind of an impediment to him finishing the series for a long time. And Roland is a character who is willing to sacrifice everything and anyone to obtain his goal, which is the Dark Tower. Similar to how a person who's addicted to something will sacrifice anything, whether it be their belongings or their loved ones, for whatever their addiction is. Obviously, this isn't a very subtextual idea. It's pretty in your face, especially in the next book, The Drawing of the Three, with the character of Eddie Dean, who is predominantly, first and foremost, a drug addict. Yet the idea of the Dark Tower as an addiction is very interesting when you consider that in relation to other tenets of Western storytelling. By Western, I mean like cowboys and cactuses, not Western like, North America and Europe. Ultimately, there's some interesting intertextuality between the Gunslinger and Death is a Lonely Business when you consider that in the Gunslinger, Stephen King is making the case that addiction is a lonely business and that ultimately addiction is death, as seen with the character of Jake and how Roland treats him. Secondly, the use of old technology and machinery is extremely creepy and effective. Again, the idea that the entire world is like an abandoned Wild West ghost town just works. And I love that so much of the book takes place in this abandoned rail line that Roland and Jake are traversing with like a pump or a hand cart, because it's cool to consider, like, what was that for? Like, who used it? Where did it go? And how long has it been abandoned for? Why are the slow mutants just congregating on it? Stephen King's descriptions in this book are some of his best anywhere in his writing, but I don't just mean his descriptions of sight. Again, his use of sound and smell are also wonderful, and I've got some excerpts here that I want to read to highlight that. And even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating, harsh dust, like scouring powder. I like this because it uses image and sound perfectly intertwined together, like they rest on each other. And then this next line describing Roland's sort of lover for a while, Allie. The room held her scent, fresh lilac, pathetic. The smell of the desert had overlaid it, crippled it. It was like the smell of the sea. He realized he was afraid of the desert ahead. So again, here we have a perfect link between character and setting to create atmosphere. So Allie is desperately trying to cling on to the niceties of the old world, but the world has moved on, and it's scaring Roland for the first time in the book because he's realizing that that world moving on and that atmosphere is replacing all pleasure of human contact and connection, whether it be romantic, physical, friendship, whatever. It doesn't matter how much perfume you put on, the entire world still stinks. This is an interesting counter again to traditional Westerns where the idea is, while yes, the setting may be hard and terrible, if you are resilient enough, if you are brave enough, eventually you can escape your surroundings, your circumstances, and improve your lot in life. This is seen in lots of classic Westerns, some of which I just recently talked about in my last video, whether that be Lonesome Dove, where they leave desolate, sad Texas for Montana, or something like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Characters like Roland, the Man in Black, and Allie all serve essentially as archetypes, as monoliths for traditional Western figures. Roland is, of course, the good, the Clint Eastwood type character who he's explicitly based on. The Man in Black is, of course, the bad. And then there's lots of other characters who are simply ugly. That would be Allie, the slow mutants. But unlike in traditional Westerns or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where violence is the answer, where you can defeat evil and ugly with violence or cunning or resilience or whatever, that doesn't work here. Roland's greatest strength is his ability to commit violence, yes, because he's a gunslinger, but ultimately that is his greatest hubris and his greatest failure as well. When he does have genuine connection to someone like Allie, the Man in Black, the bad, uses that against him, knowing that Roland is going to have to kill her and everyone else in tow. Roland is in a very helpless situation because he could kill literally every single person in Midworld. He could, it's not an issue for him. But the problem is that doesn't give him what he wants. That doesn't give him the tower. There are things between himself and the tower that he can't just blow away with his guns. The Man in Black is one of them. Yes, the Man in Black dies, but not because Roland kills him. He dies because it's simply his time to die. That death doesn't make it suddenly easier for Roland to get to the tower. It gives Roland some answers, yes, but it also creates far more questions in Roland's mind and personality and struggle with the character than it does closed doors. In fact, the entire theme of the Man in Black's death and Roland's meeting with him is the opening of doors. 3 to be specific, in the next novel, The Drawing of the Three. And in this sense, Stephen King writes an interesting counter, and Roland is the antithesis of traditional Western heroes. He can shoot his way out of every situation, yes, but he cannot shoot his way towards his actual entire goal. No matter how many bad and ugly people he kills, he will not necessarily be good at the end, and he will not be any closer to victory. This is sort of the best and ultimate representation of King's theme that the world has moved on. When the world has moved on to nothing but ugly and bad, where do you move on to if you want to escape that? Or if you want to move on from your addiction? Or if you want to move on from your quest? You can't. So Roland's only choice is to continue on this quest for the tower for his addiction forever. In the end, King raises the question of what good is a cowboy in a world that has moved on? What good is a hero? Despite Roland's ability to save, he chooses not to or frequently can't. He can only kill, as in when he lets Jake fall to his death in Sacrifice of the Tower. Music is also a huge part of Stephen King's atmosphere in The Gunslinger. Again, sound is hugely important. Whether it be Stephen King describing sounds like dust rattling against the window panes or like old signs creaking, or his descriptions of music, he uses sound to create atmosphere masterfully in this novel. In particular, his use of the song Hey Jude being played in the saloon in Tull. So with all that said, why does it matter? Who cares? Why is atmosphere important? Well, atmosphere is important for all the reasons I just said. But in more specific, concrete terms, atmosphere is important because it encompasses a lot of things that help us remember our feelings and emotions about a certain text, film, or experience. Atmosphere encompasses, as I said, sights, smell, and sounds. But also atmosphere is memorable. Very frequently, we remember atmosphere more than anything else because we remember our feeling. This is why you catch so many people that will watch or read something exclusively like for the vibes. Like things like Drive, Nightcrawler, Whiplash, or Studio Ghibli movies. I mean, these are all good works of cinema, but people watch them because a lot of times that's just the vibe. You want the vibe. Or in more academic terms, atmosphere. Studio Ghibli movies and Drive both have very specific, powerful, memorable vibes. Yet they are very different vibes. And the construction of a Studio Ghibli film and Drive are extremely different. They're so like on complete opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of how they make you feel, but their construction is fairly similar in how they dedicate so much time and emphasis to vibe and atmosphere. That's predominantly what their story relies on and where a lot of the appeal, especially initially, comes from. So, I'm sure that I'm forgetting something, and I'm also sure that similar to how Stephen King's newer books are overwritten, my video is overspoken because I wrote an outline for this, but not a specific script, so I just sort of babbled, and that's why I don't make any sense. But I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure you smash that like button and drop a comment because I'll be making more of these. Next up will obviously be the drawing of the 3, and then after that the Wastelands, and after that, and after that, and after that. Thanks for watching. Hope you liked the video. Come back next time. All right.